Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. I am going to be joined. It's been a while since I've done a live stream. I've been busy doing lots of things, and you'll see the YouTube videos to show some of that. But I haven't done a live stream in a while, but I've been looking forward to this one for a while, as we're going to be joined by our cousin, a rebel from the West, inspiring philosophy's very own Michael Jones, who's going to be talking about how Islam was bad for science, or how Islam is maybe even bad for science. And so that'll be something to look forward to. I just want to say, if you support the work that I'm doing, all the links to help me are in the description box below. I've recently launched a Christian economy app, and I want to encourage all Christians to download it and use it, as well as having created an Apologetics app. And if you haven't got that, please download that and use that as well. And both the links are also in the description box. And so without further ado, let me bring in the legendary, the one and only, Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. How are you, sir?
Good morning, Redcoat.
Morning, Rebel. How are things over there in the stolen colonies?
It's doing good, doing good. Woke up this morning, read the Declaration of Independence again. Majestic Evil flew over while I was cleaning my guns. I shed a tear thinking about freedom. You know, normal American stuff. Enjoying some coffee because all the tea is in the harbor still.
Well, I cried about the weather, the loss of tea, and why the king is letting us down. So you are going to be doing a wonderful talk for us, I do believe. On shall I bring up your slides?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I gave this talk when I was over in Britain in June at the conference over there,
and it was so good. I thought I would do it again.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, so
yeah, can you full screen that stuff?
I think so. Let me just make sure it will actually work if I do it. So, okay, yeah, it will work. You see all that?
Yeah, but I still see all the side slides.
Yeah, it won't let me do it.
Right,
I don't know why.
Well, never mind. It'll just have to. People will just have to pause it and use their magnifying glass.
Yeah, let me see if I can. No, it won't even let me do that if I take the sidebar out, which is pretty lame. But yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, well. Okay, over to you, sir. I'll let you talk until you finish. I guess I'll chip in every now and then when I want to, or if I've got a question, and then depending on when you get through the presentation, we'll have a chit chat afterwards.
Yeah, so I just uploaded a video on this topic, how Christianity created science, and that focuses more on all the good Christianity gave to science. This will include some of that, but also include stuff not in that video, specifically how Islam hindered and helped science in ways. So people get all excited because they think, well, Islam had the golden age. It was crucial for the development of science. And the answer to that is yes and no. Islam did contribute things in ways to help science, but it also had some pretty horrible aspects that prevented science from becoming anything more than that. So just some things to keep in mind as we go through this. So first thing to point out, I want to say is that, yeah, I fully acknowledge Christianity is not the only thing that gave rise to science. There are plenty of other things like Greek philosophy, advances made in the Islamic, Hindu world, Roman law, economic aspects. There was a lot of aspects that gave rise to science, no doubt. However, it's very clear that Christianity was probably the most crucial aspect for the development of science. And of course, we all hear that the Dark Ages is really what happened. It was the Christian Dark Ages that held back science. We were advancing so much. And then, of course, the Christian Dark Ages ruined everything. Of course, this is one of the dumbest graphs I've ever seen. You can see the y-axis has no metrics. Just says scientific advancement, whatever that means. It's an absurd graph. It's one of the dumbest things ever made. Not even made by an historian. But, if you actually ask real historians, they'll tell you that the Dark Ages is basically a myth. Never happened. In the great book of Popes and Unicorns, they say, seems that the Dark Ages were not that dark at all. It becomes clear that medieval intellectuals were not only rational, they were hyper-rational. To them, logic was the single most important tool for the investigation of the natural world. And Laura Grollemund says that the Dark Ages is just a myth. Never happened. There was never a time when Christianity held back science and we went into this big Dark Age period that was only saved by the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. There was a lot of advances being made at this time. So this is a great book I always recommend for people to start debunking this nonsense. Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. Great book. Every chapter has a different historian, and they debunk myths that, like, for example, the rise of Christianity was responsible for the demise of ancient science, that the medieval church suppressed the growth of science, that the medieval Christians taught that the earth was flat. That is also a myth. That the medieval church prohibited dissection. Myth. Giordano Bruno was a martyr of science. Myth. Galileo was imprisoned and tortured for advancing Copernicism. Myth. The scientific revolution was liberated from science, or that liberated science from religion. That's a myth. And that the church denounced anesthesia. That's also a myth. Noah J. Efron says in the book, generations of historians and sociologists have discovered many ways in which Christians, Christian beliefs, and Christian institutions played crucial roles in fashioning the tenets, methods, and institutions of what in time became modern science. Today, almost all historians agree that Christianity moved many early modern intellectuals to study nature systematically. Historians have found that notions borrowed from Christian beliefs found their way into scientific discourse with glorious results. The very notion that nature is lawful, some scholars argue, was borrowed from Christian theology. And that's not all. We'll get to more ways as well. But the reason why everyone thinks Christianity and science are in conflict is because of these two morons. Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper in the 1800s had a great PR campaign and put out this idea that the traditional church had been in conflict with science for generations until, of course, Protestantism, the Enlightenment really changed everything. And there's no other way to say it. Their books are just filled with lies and misquotes and getting all their facts wrong. But they had a great PR campaign. So their nonsense still goes out today. For example, even Francis Collins in his book, The Language of God, cited them as part of his research. That's how prevalent this is. The head of the Human Genome Project was still convinced that they were right. And you'll see people like Neil deGrasse Tyson cite their stuff as well. Even if he's not attributing it to them, he's getting information from them. But modern historians are pretty much convinced they don't know what they're talking about. No one takes their conflict thesis serious today. For example, in this book, they say, while some historians had always regarded the Draper-White thesis as oversimplifying and distorting a complex relationship, in the late 20th century, it underwent a more systematic reevaluation. The result is the growing recognition among historians of science that the relationship of religion and science has been much more positive than is sometimes thought. So let me give you an example of a myth you have learned, and let's debunk it. So you've all learned that Galileo was the first to discover that heavy objects and light objects fall at the same speed. We've been told that everyone thought heavy objects fall faster because Aristotle said that. And then one day, Galileo went up on the Leaning Tower of Pisa, dropped 2 objects, and debunked something that no one bothered to try for thousands of years. Allegedly. Well, that's not true. As James Hannam notes, if we read the works of John Philoponus, in the 6th century, okay, he said, if you let fall from the same height 2 weights, one of which is many times heavier than the other, you will see that the relative times required for their drop does not depend on their relative weights, but that the difference in the time taken is very small. In this passage, Philoponus is clearly referring to an experiment that he has tried himself. So in other words, this was debunked long before Galileo. That's not to say Galileo didn't do it as well, but it's not like Christians were so dumb and we're not doing experimentation early on. They most certainly were. There's an interesting story of Augustine. He was told a legend about peacock meat. And he was told that it, by the Greeks, that it didn't mold or it didn't, decay or putrefy. So he got a piece of the meat and he laid it out for 30 days or more and then checked it, and it was still in the same state. It was just a little more shriveled and drier. And I like what Hutchings and Ungariano say. They say any biologist, chemist, or physicist worth their salt would immediately recognize this passage above for precisely what it is, a fully fledged and surprisingly modern science experiment. Many popular histories of science suggest that experiments of this form only first appeared in the 1600s with the likes of Galileo, Boyle, and Hooke. Yet here we are around 420, and Augustine has beaten the lot of them to it. He has a hypothesis, a method, he has data, he has a conclusion. By referencing other meats, he even has built-in control variable of sorts. So, yeah, this is very much a Christian tradition of doing early experimentation. Even if it wasn't fully modern, we definitely see examples of this early on. So, early thinkers that people may not be aware of, John Philoponus, very early writer. He studied philosophy, physics, cosmology, theology. He even challenged and corrected Aristotle, something that was unheard of at the time. Aristotle was considered to be one of the ancients. You didn't challenge him. Yet the Christians had no reservations about challenging him if they found out he was wrong. And we see this throughout the Middle Ages, for example. He even had a concept that prefigured medieval impetus theory in Newton's first law of motion. See, Aristotle had this idea that objects stay in motion because of like a continuous external force, like air is pushing something, which we know is absurd. Air slows objects down. Philoponus, of course, said that, agreed with that. And he was like, yeah, that's ridiculous to say that air would be pushing an object. It's the other way around. So he challenged that. We also have Leo the mathematician in the East. People think the East was filled with idiots. Sometimes you'll get that in the West, but no, even in the East, they still were making advances. Like Leo the mathematician studied mathematics, Aristotelian logic, astronomy, medicine, phylogeny. He was the first to introduce numbers instead of letters into arithmetic and algebra in the East. He preserved the works of Archimedes and others, and he composed his own medical encyclopedia. And then his school developed a smaller and more efficient script that took up less space and allowed for ancient documents to be copied quicker. People may have heard of Bede, but they don't know he also did some scientific work. He investigated natural phenomenon. Like, for example, Pliny the Elder said that, the reason they're trying to figure out why rivers and lakes have fresh water and the sea has salt water, and they're trying to figure out why they don't, like why that is. And Pliny said, well, you see, when the fresh water hits the salty sea, it sinks to the bottom and then goes into these subterranean tunnels that take it back to their sources at the top of the rivers. And Bede was like, well, that's nonsense. And he investigated this and said, well, no, the fresh water floats on top of the salt water. It's not sinking. So Pliny has to be wrong. And so, this scientific observation, here we go, and disproving the ancient Greeks about some of their ideas and suggesting, no, that can't be the case. So here's some other early natural philosophers you probably have never heard of. Notice on this list, you have a friggin' Pope, Pope Sylvester II. If the church was anti-science, how is a friggin' Pope, who is a scientist, being turned into Pope? It doesn't make sense. This idea they were anti-science is absurd. Other natural philosophers from the second millennium, again, this is just a short list. There are so so many others I could cover. But let's talk a little bit about Islam here. Okay, so this is an historian, sociologist named Toby Huff. And he has spent his career trying to answer a very simple question that has perplexed historians. Okay, which is real simple. We know that the Middle East, the Islamic world, was more advanced than the Christian world in the 900s, the 1000s, the 1100s, 1200s. Why didn't modern science come out of them? It didn't happen. Modern science came out of the Christian West. That is strange. They were more advanced. But we know around the 1300s, things in the Islamic world started to slow down. And so they're trying to figure this out. And Toby Huff has spent his career trying to answer this question. As you can see, this is the third edition of his book because he keeps updating, getting more information about this. And so this is the question he's trying to. Here's what he comes to the conclusion of. The so-called Islamic sciences were those devoted to the study of the Quran, the tradition of the Prophet, legal knowledge, theology, poetry, and Arabic knowledge. For the purpose of dividing inheritance, arithmetic was also an important subject of study. So far, so good. Moreover, due to the ritual and religious prescriptions, timekeeping found it necessary to use geometry and eventually to invent trigonometry in order to arrive at a requisite calculation to determine the directions of Mecca for prayer. In short, driven by both curiosity and religious motives, the Arab-Muslim world from the 8th century to the 14th century achieved significant heights of scientific advance. But thereafter, and perhaps as early as the 12th century, went into decline and even retrogression. Here's what he's basically saying, guys. Okay. In Islam, you have the Islamic sciences, study of the Quran, the Hadith, the legal knowledge, theology. Then you have the foreign sciences, arithmetic, study of the Greek classics, anything other than the study of the Quran or the Islamic sciences. Okay. Those are the foreign sciences. In Islam, everything is subject under Islam. Everything has to serve Islam. So the foreign sciences were only so good as they help to serve Islam. Yeah, we can develop science because we need to figure out timekeeping so we know what time it is to pray. We need to develop trigonometry so we know what the direction of Mecca is, so we know the direction to pray. But once we figure that stuff out, we're done with the foreign sciences. We don't need them anymore. Discard them. They've helped us figure everything out. Move on. So yeah, as you can see, this is why the Islamic world was a little more advanced for a couple hundred years. And then they fell behind because they stopped making advances because they had figured out everything they needed for Islam. And then they were done with the foreign sciences.
Michael, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. What's up? What happened?
Yeah, you just froze for a second.
All
The
right.
last thing that I heard was when the Muslim community was done with the foreign sciences for prayer and such, they were done with it. And that was the last thing that I heard. So
Yeah,
you cut
they
out
were
for a
done with
minute.
it. And then all I said was that didn't happen in the Christian West. They kept making advances because they didn't have the same type of theology. They didn't have this idea that everything had to be under Christianity and it was only good as it served theology. You know, they didn't have that same mentality in the Christian West. So this is why Islamic world was more advanced for a couple hundred years, and then they fell into retrogression and decline because they had used the sciences as much as they could to help Islam, and then they were done with them. So he says, for those who believe that the Quran is a complete book of knowledge and explanation of all things, there was little inspiration left to investigate things apart from showing that all things are ordained by God and explicated in his holy book. In the quest for infallible knowledge, Ghazali found no hope in philosophy, much less in theology. Whoever claims, Ghazali wrote, that theology, abstract proofs, systematic classification are the foundation of belief is an innovator. And we all know that in Islam, being an innovator is a great sin. So even scientists were considered innovators for a while, which was a term for the heretic, non-believer, and subject to death. Could you imagine having a religion where you equate the term innovator and heretic? Wow, yep. What a religion. Consequently, he cascaded those who wallowed in systematic theology, kalam, for those who pursue that course, who delve into arcane logic and philosophical analyses he averred are in grave religious danger. It is only the simple folk who are far from this danger. I can't read this quote without laughing because it's just hilarious. And the rest of those common folk who have not waded into research and inquiry, not wallow in systematic theology, as if we're an absolute standard of reference. So in other words, be a simple dumb folk. You don't want to be one of those people wading into theology and science and study. You're in danger of being a heretic or being far from the truth. You want to be a dumb, stupid person who doesn't do this kind of stuff. That's Islam, folks.
Don't question what the Prophet and Allah have decided.
Exactly.
Once a matter is decided by Allah and his Prophet, it's not fitting for a believer to question it.
Don't question Allah or Muhammad. You have to submit to all of Muhammad's decisions.
Don't think.
Thinking is haram in Islam. This is the book. Actually, I read this book after I had left. I read this on vacation because I left Britain and went on vacation for a week. This is the book I read because this is the kind of stuff I do for fun on vacation. I read his earlier edition many years ago, and I was like, "Oh, he came out with a new edition. I'll read this on vacation." He said, in order to not challenge Muslim orthodoxy, cultural and religious prescriptions had restricted Muslim intellectual life. The empirical sciences like astronomy, mathematics, and medicine pose no threat to Islamic teaching and therefore receive the support and encouragement of the Muslim state. But it feels like philosophy were another matter altogether. Muslim scholars have produced numerous translations of the works of Plato and Aristotle, among others, and have written extensive commentaries on them, but very original philosophical work had been done. Moreover, those scholars who had ventured into these fields were regarded with disapproval by most of their contemporaries. So, yeah, you can comment on Aristotle. Again, you can do sciences like maybe astronomy, mathematics, and medicine if it helps Islam. But things like philosophy, oh, no, that's an innovator. We can't do that. He says even a figure like Ibn Rushd, okay, the greatest Aristotelian scholar of his age, was a marginal figure in the Islamic intellectual world. Distrusted by his insistence that because certain passages of the Quran contradicted the truth derived from Greek philosophy, those passages were therefore not to be read literally, but instead to be interpreted metaphorically. Ibn Rushd was something of an intellectual outcast, summoned before the local Almohad ruler to answer charges of apostasy. Ibn Rushd lied and swore that he had never read the works of Aristotle, much less actually translated or commented upon them. So the Almohad Caliphate was trying their hardest to prevent science from advancing and even persecuting very important figures like Ibn Rushd, whose works became quite influential in the Christian West and helped in many, many ways. But in the Islamic world, not so much. So this is the problem we have with the Islamic world in terms of science and how it was holding things back. Meanwhile, in the Christian West, another story was unfolding. So how did Christianity help science? Well, let's talk about some things. First, the concept of monotheism. There's an omnipotent God who created the universe. And, you go back to ancient pagan cultures that believed the world was governed by many gods. They tended to think the world was unpredictable and chaotic, product of supernatural chaos. So notice I said tended. There were exceptions, no doubt. But in Christian monotheism, if you have one God who controls everything, he's omnipotent, he dominates all, no one can challenge him. So he decrees a word, it is the end all be all. You can't change it unless he decides to change it. So Mark Worthing says, one might think that monotheism, especially these formed with strong affirmations of God's sovereignty, would have been little different to polytheism. Didn't monotheism simply roll up the function of the various competing deities into one package? But that's not what happened. In most cases, belief in one God, especially an all-powerful, all-knowing sovereign God, led people to look increasingly to natural causes. An all-powerful sovereign God, while certainly capable of intervention in need of miracle, would create and govern the world in such a way as to ordainedly follow regular and therefore comprehensive patterns. So you might say, well, Islam is a monotheistic God, but let's talk about another aspect here. God is a rational creator. He keeps his covenants, and his words and decrees are binding. He doesn't change his mind. Okay? He is not the best of deceivers, as it is in Islam. He will keep his word and his decrees. And that's important because in Genesis 8, God makes a covenant with nature. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. In Deuteronomy 7, Psalm 105 says he keeps his covenant forever. Okay, he remembers it. Okay, so if he made a covenant with nature, that's not going to change. Okay, he's not going to decide to abrogate it one day. He's not going to decide to change that, or he's deceiving us somehow. So this is what we see repeated throughout Scripture. Now, this is important. Let's go back to Toby Huff. Says the image of nature enthusiastically embraced by Christian thinkers entitled both the notion of orderliness or hierarchy and lawfulness that was entirely opposite to the religious thinkers of early and medieval Islam that we saw earlier. The European medievals had discovered the world as a universe, a cosmos of connected and interlocking parts. In other words, God set up creation. He keeps his covenants. We can trust that the laws he imbued in nature will be the same today as they are tomorrow, and in a week, and in years from now. So we can make a systematic understanding of the lawfulness of nature. Medieval Islam, they lack that. God, Allah is a deceiver. He can change his words. You can't really trust him. Not the same with the God of Christianity. Also, people think that Christianity gave us all these dogmatic limits, but it actually removed dogmatic limits. So let's talk about this. In 1277, the teachings of Aristotle were banned in Paris by the bishop. People go, oh, this is evidence that Christianity was anti-science. But Edward Grant notes about this condemnation. Here's what he says. The most significant aspect of the condemnation of 1277 was not the condemnation of Aristotle's offensive ideas about Christian doctrine, but rather the condemnation of his ideas that seemed to limit God's absolute power to do whatever he pleased short of a logical contradiction. They firmly believed that for God, Aristotle's natural impossibilities were all supernaturally possible. In other words, guys, they were worried that Aristotle was going to limit inquiry, philosophical and scientific inquiry. If you have Aristotle's God who's limited in natural ways, that's going to limit possibilities and what can be explored. We got to stop that because God's not limited. So we should be able to study everything. In other words, they were trying to advance science and remove all the limits, not hold it back. So the church was less dogmatic and more open-minded than Aristotle. They wanted all possibilities on the table. And by the way, the ban on Aristotle didn't last. They obviously removed it. And then even with that, Aristotle's limitations didn't hold anyone back. Christians were very much like, yeah, that's not our God. So not a big problem. We also see in the Bible that we are to desire God. Okay. But we also learn in Romans 1 that his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that they have been made. So, in other words, we're to desire God. How can we learn more about God? Well, we can study creation. It says it right there. We can learn more about him by studying creation. How is that not going to advance science? It most certainly did. Margaret Osler says the Bible was a powerful source of teleological thinking. According to the Old Testament tradition, God created the world ex nihilo by his power and will. His wisdom and power are evident in the creation. A biblical verse frequently quoted by early modern natural philosophers proclaimed, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. So, biblical theology led to the idea we could know more about God by studying creation. Christians throughout the centuries have desired to know more about God and believe they could by studying his creation. So why were Christians so obsessed with studying the natural world throughout our history? They wanted to know more about the Creator. So very, very important aspect there. In Islam, you don't have this idea that we can learn more about Allah by studying creation. You learn more about Allah by studying the Quran and the Hadith. They don't have a concept of the two books like we have in Christianity, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. It's all the Quran, baby. It's all the Hadith. It's all that. That's how you learn more about Allah. Now, here's something that, of course, Islam doesn't have. It's the image of God. God is reasonable, and we are like him, then we should also be reasonable. We can understand what he has made and how he has made it, and we have the rational capacity to discover his laws. Johannes Kepler was inspired by this. He was like, well, if I'm like God, I can study nature as well. Toby Huff says, again, going back to the contrast between Islam and Christianity, it was just the conception of a lawful natural order with man serving as co-creator that was rejected by the religious scholars of Islam during its formative years. It was an often repeated Islamic doctrine, as we have seen, that God has no partners and none share any attributes with him. That view seems to imply, as suggested by other writers, that man cannot have more knowledge than God. While such foreign knowledge could easily be seen as undermining religious belief, a common fear among Muslims, especially those most committed to the Sunnah of the Hadith tradition, the opposite of the Christian credo that man was created in the image of God. So for Islam, humans were like ants to God. We can't think that we could ever be like him in that regard. So why even bother? And this was also the belief of early Christian, pagan writers like Celsus. One of his arguments against the Christians was, you stupid Christians, you think you're like the image of God, you're his offspring? That's absurd. We're like ants or bees compared to the gods. How could we ever learn their ways? So here we have a continuation of more of a pagan idea that is more similar to what we find in Islam, and the Christian idea is the exact opposite. And of course, this was helpful for science. But again, it wasn't just the fact that we're the image of God. It's also the fall that was crucial for the development of science. I just pointed this out in my debate with Dan Barker, and he was completely dumbfounded by this. He had never heard it before, which shows you how much he has really studied this. According to the fall, which again, lacking in Islam, if we are fallen, our logic and reason are useful, but marred. They offer no guarantee of truth on their own. Therefore, it follows we have to do repeated experimentation to verify results. This is the scientific method. Okay, that it comes out of the Christian tradition for a reason. Take the Imago Dei plus the fall, you get the scientific method, or at least the basis for it. Noah J. Efron says Augustine's notion of original sin was embraced by advocates of experimental natural philosophy. As they saw it, fallen humans lacked the grace to understand the workings of the world through cognition alone, requiring in their disgraced state painstaking experiment and observation. In this way, Christian doctrine lent urgency to experiment. Peter Harrison says, in short, in order to recover the knowledge of the nature lost as a consequence of the fall and to regain our dominion over natural things, we presently need special measures to overcome our fallen conditions. These are provided by the kind of experimental science practiced by the Royal Society. So once again, the Imago Dei and the fallen nature was crucial for advancing experimental science. Complicated theology as well was important for advancing science. How many times have you heard a Muslim say, what does 1 + 1 + 1 = 1? Haha, you Trinity, it's all nonsense. Well, actually, the doctrine of the Trinity, incarnation, Eucharist, did help advance science. Why? Well, because these things are not easily comprehensible. We have to admit that. And so we need to find new ways to explain them. We have to study the Greek philosophies, sometimes come up with new terms to better understand these important doctrines. Well, this encouraged them to open their minds and explore research. Here's an extended quote from Edward Grant, but it's an important quote, so pay attention. Certain aspects of their religion may also have drawn Christians to Greek philosophy. One example is the problem of the Eucharist, with its difficulties about the nature of substances and their attributes. Adoption of a Trinitarian position placed enormous metaphysical burdens on Christianity. Once Jesus was perceived as the Son of God, the problems of expounding the nature of the Godhead were formidable indeed. To help explain such theological difficulties, scholars deemed the concepts and terminology of Greek metaphysics essential. Logic was considered important. Islam was much less driven by inherent theological needs to seek out Greek philosophy than was Christianity. Indeed, Islamic theologians discouraged analyses of the Quran and prevented the development of a speculative theology. Latin Christianity provided a sympathetic environment for the sustenance and advance of natural philosophy and science. In other words, guys, because we had a more complicated theology, or more maybe we should say a theology that's harder to comprehend, I wouldn't say it's necessarily more complicated. There might be ways it could be more simple, philosophically speaking, in terms of parsimony. But because it was harder to comprehend, we had to seek out Greek philosophy to help explain these terms. And then that helped us advance science. It opened our minds, encouraged critical thinking, and a lot of what was being studied in theology spilled over into natural philosophy. This did not happen in Islam. So maybe, I don't know, maybe when God revealed that he is a Trinity, but didn't explain that further, maybe he knew what he was doing. Maybe he did that on purpose so that we would be encouraged to study more, and then in turn advance science, which led to technological growth, which made the world such a better place. It's almost like God knows exactly what he's doing. We also have something Islam doesn't have, the separation of church and state. Goes back to Jesus saying, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and render to God the things that are God. Now, by separation of church and state, I don't mean the way secularists interpret it. It just means in Christianity, different powers or heads take care of different aspects. The head of the state takes care of earthly matters, and the head of the church takes care of spiritual matters. We don't have, it's not this idea where we keep religion completely out of the secular, out of the state issues. That's absurd and impossible. Okay. But what developed from this is the idea of the two books, the book of nature and the book of scripture. Christianity developed this idea of separation of institutions. Okay. If the state can be a separate institution than the church, why can't academia? Why can't the study of science? You can study science without being a theologian and vice versa. This starts to develop through the Christian tradition. Again, back to Edward Grant, he says positive feelings towards natural philosophy may have inadvertently been fostered by the Christian attitude toward the state, exemplified in Jesus' call to render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's. Although many Christian churchmen, such as St. Augustine, proclaim the superiority of the church over the state, the Christian church did acknowledge and accept the separation of church and state, which allowed for the development of a secularly oriented natural philosophy. In medieval Islam, by contrast, truly secular government was absent, and the church and state were one. In other words, guys, Islam, again, doesn't allow for separation of institutions. Everything is under the Quran in Islam. So you can never let science develop into its own institution. It's only there to benefit Islam, and that prevents modern science from developing. This was crucial for the development of science. And it also helped to create modern universities. The schools of Alexandria and Constantinople were both royal foundations that depended on the whim of the monarch for money and patronage. In contrast, the new universities of Western Europe enjoyed a special kind of status that made them effectively independent. Modern universities were invented by Christians, not Muslims. Okay, the idea of an independent institution that is not bound to the whims of a imam or a monarch or a ruler, that's a Christian idea. Toby F. says, clearly Islamic religious philosophers had become emboldened and felt no need to depend on philosophy. There was no suggestion that philosophy was to be the handmaiden of theology. Rather, it was to be disparaged. So again, Islam is about memorizing, studying the Quran, not bringing on and doing systematic theology. Another important thing is that Christianity removed old taboos. Look at, for example, this idea about, we see these ritualistic laws in Judaism and Islam. Sorry, I had to spray my cats. They're fighting. In Islam and Judaism, there are rules for touching dead bodies. Certain animals are prohibited, like pigs. Yet Christian Europe lacked these restrictions and led the way to dissection in human anatomy. In this book, they say, while the Greek and Roman avoidance of human dissection seems to have had roots in the belief that corpses were ritually unclean, early Christian culture broke definitively with the idea of corpse pollution, embracing tombs as holy places and the bodies of dead as objects of veneration and potential sources of magical healing powers. Now, that sounds anti-scientific, but what it led to the idea is that early Christians were fine to go near dead bodies. And in later centuries, they started to dissect these dead bodies. It developed an advanced medical science. This was, again, lacking in the Islamic world. One can say that the Europeans, unlike Muslims, had in fact launched a program of empirical inquiry into the constitution of the human body as part of that inquiry, and part of that inquiry necessitated dissecting human bodies. Conversely, postmortem examinations for forensic purposes in the Islamic world were said to be strictly forbidden, as they were in China for different reasons. Not only was there an aversion to dissecting pigs as well as the human body, Islamic medicine education of the time was devoted to memorization of texts. So medicine in Islam was about memorizing texts. In Christianity, they got their hands dirty. They went in, they looked at pigs first, dissected them, then they started dissecting human cadavers, and they started to make advances. Why do we live in a world now where we can't have coming up with cures for cancer? People are now living longer. Life expectancies are going up. We have advanced things like open heart surgery and brain surgery. You can thank the Christian history for this. You can thank Christianity for this. Christianity allowed humans to go near dead bodies. They started studying the human bodies and look at the advances that have slowly built up coming out of that. You can really thank Christianity for the reason we have so much medical advances. Okay. I just got LASIK done and my eyes I can now have 20/15 vision for the first time in probably 5 years. It's great. Wouldn't have happened without the gospel, to be honest. Let's just look at a comparison. These were the best charts that the Islamic world produced on human anatomy. These are the best they could come up with. Okay. Meanwhile, a couple hundred years later in Christian Europe, after they started dissecting bodies, this is what they're coming up with. Okay. Pales in comparison. You can just see the difference of what dissecting allowed the Christian world to do. So, what did Christianity give us? All these different aspects, they all come back and they reconvene into give us science. All these doctrines were important for advancing and giving us modern science. Islam has monotheism, and that's about it. But really, you need all of this to build a robust, systematic understanding of science, a robust scientific methodology. Islam cannot foster that. Christianity could. There's no contest. Even Friedrich Nietzsche had to admit, he admitted that we men of knowledge of today, we godless men and anti-metaphysicians, we too still derive our flame from the fire ignited by a faith-old millennia, the Christian faith. So again, I'll say it wasn't only Christianity that gave rise to science. There were other things, but without this, we would never have gotten to this. When Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly, he was talking about things beyond anyone's imagination. And we can now see the effects of it today. Christianity has truly changed the world. And in one ways, it gave rise to science. So thank you.
What a wonderful presentation, bro. Absolutely amazing. I enjoyed it so much at the NAPC conference, which there will, of course, be one next year for those that want to join it. That I thought it would be good to have you on to talk about it and to do it here again. I just want to start with your last point, which is you highlighted the fact that Christianity bejeweled Western civilization with the cultural resources that gave rise to the paradigmatic matrix of the scientific worldview. And what I note is that as our Western civilization has moved away from its Christian foundations, it's actually becoming anti-science. So, for instance, you've got transgenderism. You've got attacks on the idea that maths is white. Like it's a white thing, a white man's mathematics. And so we're moving into a post-scientific age as the more that progressive ideology becomes entrenched in our institutions. We're actually moving away from science. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that thesis.
Oh no, you're absolutely right. People think this was the promise of the new atheist, that they were going to take us into an age of science and reason, and we get away from old superstitions. And now you see, for example, in Britain, metaphysics shops opening everywhere and tarot card reading rising. And I remember seeing a clip of Richard Dawkins walking around like perplexed by the fact that these are all opening up in Britain. I'm like, bro, if you actually knew your history, you would know that Christianity gave rise to modern science. Without it, what are people going to do? They're going to revert back to old pagan ideas, horoscopes, tarot cards.
The idea that truth is something objective rather than subjective.
199 genders. men can have periods and get pregnant,
Yeah.
and you can be
Yes.
anything you want to be. It's
I
absurd.
remember when I worked for a major company, a major pharmaceutical company, and in a staff meeting, they talked to me that it was said like they said and the words were something along the lines of people that have periods, and I went, I'm sorry, people that have periods? Don't you mean women that have periods? My boss looked at me with sort of excruciating agony and went, no, people that have periods. She was a woman herself, and it was just like it's just the fact that we're moving into this anti-scientific paradigm in which truth is subjected and subjective to one's feelings, over and above the empirical evidence, is a sign that we've run out of the cultural resource that Christianity have given us. And this idea that we can build a society on reason alone assumes that reason works. You can work in a vacuum, and it doesn't. It always works within a cultural milieu. Something that the new atheists were completely oblivious to in their arguments.
Oh yeah, it's absurd what they've done. I mean, they don't realize that every reason, everything we have has a foundation, and you just can't pull that foundation out and expect things to not change radically. This is the principle behind Chesterton's fence. The idea that if you buy a property and there's a fence on it, you don't remove the fence unless you know exactly what it's there for, because maybe it's there for something important. These moronic new atheists from Dawkins to Harris just showed up and thought, well, religion here, the thing that we've had for what, over 1,000 years in the West, we don't need that anymore. It serves no purpose. We know best because we've been here for a couple years, and therefore we can just get rid of this and nothing.
We arrived yesterday. We don't need that fence. What's that supporting wall doing there? That's just silly. Let's knock it down.
Exactly. And they don't know what they're talking about.
The new atheists certainly did popularize the Dark Age myth. But they expanded it to the whole of Christianity. And I think, speaking as a historian of religion, it's probably important just to point out that the term Dark Ages was a Christian term, and it was used to refer to the collapse of the Roman world, the Roman system of doing things, when law, order, a cultivated society just disappeared, and the church described this as the Dark Ages. So it's got nothing to do with science. It's got everything to do with the mourning of a Romanized society to the loss of their Roman civilization and the emergence of the barbarian kingdoms. And a lot of those barbarian kingdoms were initially Aryan as well. So it wasn't just Dark Ages in the sense of it's the end of the Roman civilization, but it was Dark Ages in the sense of, for a very brief moment in time, Western Europe was dominated by Aryan kingdoms.
And even it wasn't that bad as a lot of the later thinkers, like the humanists of the 14 and 1500s, had thought. They had this idea that was super bad. It actually was a little bit better, especially for the poor during this time, because centralization broke down and they didn't have to pay so much money to this central government and state. So a lot of the peasants of Europe actually ate better, as remains on skeletons have found. They were getting more meat and more sustenance because things became decentralized. And now, for a change, these poor people they're more on their own in the countryside. So they actually had a better time during that period. Now, what sort of slowed down for a little while was the amount of texts, the amount of preserving of ancient copies, these kinds of things. But during the Carolinginian era,
learning.
Moss of Rome, for sure. But even during that time, peasants were making advances in farming. Like they were inventing new farming technologies. Britain was being cultivated in ways it couldn't have been cultivated during the Roman world. Rodney Stark has said that one of the best things that ever happened was the collapse of the Roman Empire, because it forced a lot of these people to now that they're on their own, they have to come up with new solutions to problems, like the drained swamps. They have to come up with new farming technologies. Because they can't, in Britain, they can't just basically stop fighting. Sorry, my cats are fighting. I had to do that.
It's okay. It's okay. You've got to sort out your cats.
So I have this trust.
But I think there was nothing dark about the Dark Ages, nothing. And it's certainly there's nothing dark about the Dark Ages in the terms of learning. The Dark Ages is a term that was basically it was a cultural shock term by the church that had been incubated in the Roman world about the loss of Roman civilization. And that's what it was. And then in the Enlightenment, what happens is that term gets picked up again, out of the dustbin of history. The bits get shaken off the lettuce, and then it gets represented as Christianity stops science, and those were the Dark Ages. And that's what people think the Dark Ages were all about. And obviously, it's fallacious nonsense.
We also have, for example, the humanists of the 14 and 1500s. They were so convinced that there was this medieval period was dark, they started destroying books to be used as covers for their own books. Now, luckily, at that time, the printing press was invented, so a lot of those medieval works did get preserved by the printing press. But if the printing press had not existed, we probably would have lost dozens of medieble works.
That is interesting. I'm surprised by that. The humanists in the were destroying things in the early Renaissance.
Yeah, James Hannam talks about this in his book, The Genesis of Science, for people who want to look that up. But he points this out that they were so convinced of this Dark Ages and that anything happening in the medieval period was just stupidity. We don't have to worry about it. Just destroy their books. We'll use them to make our own covers for our books, because those are the ones that really matters. And the real learning was during the Roman world. And so, those books were not being studied anymore. So this is why we lost a lot of this stuff about, like, for example, like Robert Grosseteste or Roger Bacon that we only rediscovered more recently. And so, that was a whole interesting time that they were doing. And, it just goes to show you they didn't know what they were talking about.
I think one of the things that we need to sort of frame properly, I think, when we're talking about this, is that we often talk about this as the Christian world, when really we're talking about the Western Christian world. And we sometimes forget that through the whole period that we're talking about, including the Dark Ages, the early medieval period, and the higher and middle of the Middle Ages, there was a Christian world in the East, in the Roman Empire of the East, which we in the West call the Byzantine Empire, because we didn't want to call it the Roman Empire, but the people over there called themselves Romans right up until after the 1400s, And so there was a Christian world there, and there was continuity of learning. So just out of interest in your studies, did you come across learning in Christian learning in the Eastern Roman Empire, and was it the same as in the West, or was it different? Did it lag behind? Because, for instance, you've got the example, the use of Greek fire in the lifting of the siege of Constantinople, when the Arabs came over, the Arab Islam jihadis came over to try and conquer it in the 700s, and it seems to me that the East has its own tradition of learning that we're not particularly aware of. There was a reason why everybody saw Constantinople as this fantastical society, with street lamps and that burn all night and was well cultivated. So I'm just wondering if you've come across much learning connected to the Eastern Byzantine Empire.
Yeah. What is it? Yeah, that's why one of the people I brought up in my talk was Leo the mathematician. He was in the East, and his school developed that minuscule script that allowed them to copy and preserve texts. Very, very important. I mean, they developed Greek fire. They had lamps. The problem for the East, though, is that it really was the Crusades. You had like the Fourth Crusade of the 1200s. Then instead of going to Jerusalem, they decided to just take over Constantinople and make it a Western colony. And that decimated their power, because they had brought in someone who they thought was an ally who was going to help them fight the Muslims. And then they just turned on them. They were betrayed. So the West is really responsible for the collapse of Constantinople. It was awful what the Crusaders did. And then, of course, the Easterners went to Nicaea and they reconvened, and they eventually took back Constantinople using every last little bit they could to get it back. But then their fate was sealed because the Turks rose up and eventually defeated them. And, of course, Then they made a horrible mistake of a Hungarian invented new cannons, and he went to try to sell them to Constantinople, and they said no. So then the douchebag went and sold them to the Turks, and the Turks used them to blast through the walls of Constantinople, causing it to collapse. So really sad history there. And then of course the Russians were on their way a couple hundred years later to take back Constantinople, and then the British showed up to help the Turks.
Yeah, the West stopped them again. Yeah, that's a slightly, we're getting slightly off center of our podcast. So
I know I lament the loss of Constantinople.
We both lament the loss of Constantinople, and we know from the prophecies that God will return it to the church, and there will be a divine liturgy sung again in Hagia Sophia. So make Constantinople Christian again. But let's focus back on the thing, because I just think it would be a compliment at some point for someone to do studies on Christian learning in places like Armenia, Ethiopia, and the Byzantine Empire, to compare it with its comparison in the West up to the same periods, just to see what, if any, developments were going on there and what the attitude to scientific learning was in those countries. Because I think it would just seal the argument. It would just seal this argument, which is sometimes disputed, because a lot of people don't know about the contribution of Western Christendom to the progress of science, which your presentation does a great job of.
Historians will talk about this. Historians will talk about this. The East had preserved a lot of works that by the second millennium, the West had recovered. So this idea we got them all from the Islamic world is not true. We did find some in Spain for sure. They weren't being studied as much for that matter, but we did find a bunch in Constantinople, bring them back to the West. What you got to think of it though is that the East was definitely more advanced for a time being, but they were also sort of like the border, protecting the Muslim invasions. They devoted a lot of time and energy to that. But because they did that, it gave the West time to nurture and grow and foster and develop a science that became modern science. It would not have happened without the East being that buffer zone for us. Because if we were doing the things that Charles Martel was doing in 732 all the time, we would never have had the time to sit back, foster and grow science. The Carthaginian era would not have been as great as it was, because they would have been always on that forefront fighting. Because again, what basically you have Charles Martel turn the Muslims back, and then the Spanish sort of take over and become that other wall, pushing the Muslims slowly further south. And Constantinople is the other wall. And so this is why you don't actually see that much advancing of science in the Spanish world. Now, what they contributed is they kept finding new texts. They translated them from Arabic into other languages, and then they started spreading throughout Britain, France, Germany, these areas, Italy as well.
It should also just be pointed out that it was Christians who originally translated those texts from Greek into Arabic. When we talk about the Islamic Golden Age, what people on the progressive left, for instance, don't know or don't witness is that Islamic Golden Age was built on the back of and considerably contributed to by the native Syrian Greek Christians of the region, who translated and were absolutely essential to the very infrastructure of the caliphates, because they were too dumb to be able to run their own empire.
Well, that's another important point you brought up. If you read like Robert Hoyland or Richard Bachman, the guy I cited here today, they note that when the Muslims took over, for the first 400 years, 500 years, the majority population was not Muslim. The elites, the rulers were Muslim. So the people making the advances, copying texts, working for the Muslims, were Christian, were Jews. Then slowly over time, due to Sharia and dhimmi status, the Muslims started to take over. What did that sort of coincide with? A couple hundred years later, we start to see a decline of science throughout the Islamic world. It's what an odd coincidence. When the Middle East starts becoming more predominantly Muslim, science really starts to go down. But in those first 400, 500 years, the majority of people in the Middle East were still Christian or Jewish, but the elites, the rulers, were Muslim.
Yeah.
Funny how that works.
Funny. Which brings me on to a point that I think, I don't know whether you're aware of it or whether it's something you want to research or perhaps you are, but you just for whatever reason didn't mention it this time, is the theology of incidentalism that exists within Islam. So in the Christian world, we believe that God at the very beginning creates everything. Everything that is necessary for the universe to function is there right from the start. And then it just plays itself forward. Whereas in the Islamic world, God creates each moment in time as it's happening. And so there is no theology there by which you can extrapolate the idea of consistent universal laws. So for instance, in the Christian world, this piece of paper falling is connected to the fact that God created a world in which that was a law. But in the Islamic world, that piece of paper falling happens because Allah wills it. So if Allah didn't will it, it wouldn't fall. And so there isn't a theology, a theological bedding from which the idea of universal natural laws can begin to evolve.
Yeah, I am studying that still a little bit more right now. I need to read a couple more books on it before I do anything more. So I've been saving that because I want to read more books on this topic. But yeah, that is an issue that Clifford Bachman pointed out, that in Islam, they lack this idea of like, yeah, the things in the past have caused the things now. Everything is just a decree of Allah. Everything, he's just decreeing everything. It's all coming from him. You don't have to think about other things being part of that. It's just whatever he wants. So why develop a systematic study of the natural world?
Yeah, I've got a missionary friend who was flying out to Pakistan, and as they were flying out to Pakistan and the plane was coming into land, the pilot came onto the radio and said, "Inshallah, we will land in the next, we're going to land in the next 10 minutes." And my friend was chuckling to himself, thinking, like, what do you mean if God wills? Like, are you not sure? Is there somehow in doubt that we're going to land? So there was, and so that's the kind of cultural matrix.
But think about the good news in that. So we're worried about the Islamic invasion, but think about how Muslims, if they want to operate in the modern world, they have to act Christian. They're not acting Muslim. Islam is a religion for the 7th century. It's not a religion for the modern world. It cannot be a religion for the modern world. So these Muslims may religiously believe they're Muslim, but they act pragmatically like Christians. They have to fly planes. They have to be doctors. They're getting all that stuff from Christianity. This is what Tom Holland talks about. Christianity has saturated the world. That's a good sign for us, because if they're already thinking Christian, that means Christianity is really the religion that is taking over and changing the world and advancing the future and making progress. And that means Islam is a religion of the past. It's meant to be left in the dustbins of history. And if we know anything about the way economics, history works, that progression is going to continue, and Islam will continue to be just a relic of the past.
Yeah, exactly. And it was Christians who contributed to the development of the scientific method. Roger Bacon, John Buridan, Robert Grosseteste, amongst others, who influenced the way that people understood the world, but also how they began to investigate it and how they began to probe nature. The thought of stacking up evidence to come to conclusions, or repeating experiments. This was rooted in a Christian milieu. And one of the passages that you referenced only in passing, but I think is a good complement to your Romans 1 passage that you quoted, is Psalm 19, where it says, and you did reference it, but it's just worth going over again. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the works of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. And so, that's the Judeo-Christian understanding of that nature is speaking to us. And when you think about how scientific inquiry uses mathematics, and how we are discovering mathematics, learning mathematics from nature, that means that we're learning another language of another mind, that being God's mind. and it is communicating to us the glory of God, because anyone who studies physics and the maths behind physics, it's just mind blowing, quite literally. And that comes that impulse to investigate that comes from a worldview where you actually expect to learn something from God by nature, which is a point that you highlighted. But I just thought Psalm 19 expressed it rather well.
Yeah. No, it's great. Yeah. But I mean, like, I think from studying this, I just have more high hopes for the future, because to operate in the modern world, you have to think and act Christian, even if you don't realize it. What does that tell you? If you want to keep advancing the world, we need to keep acting and thinking more Christian. That's great news. Like, could you imagine if a country just became more Muslim? Their economics, their scientific progress is going to deteriorate, let alone human rights.
Look at Pakistan and India. Pakistan and India, perfect example. Pakistan and India, two countries born at the same time, from the exact same starting point. And India has now put men on the moon, and Pakistan is 2 steps away from falling apart and its nuclear arsenal falling into the hands of terrorists.
Right.
But another example: Ethiopia and Somalia.
Good one.
That would be another example. Another example:
Ethiopia,
Lebanon before the Muslims moved in and the Palestinians moved in, compared to anything that the Muslims have done in Gaza or West Bank or the examples.
Yeah, you keep going. I mean, Somalia just considered passing like laws allowing for religious freedom. And they of course shut them down. But I mean, that's a good sign that people in that country are starting to think that we can't be operating like the past, like under Sharia, that this is not the future. You see it in Saudi Arabia, them secularizing more. They cannot keep operating under that, because that's a system of the past. It's a system of the past. It's not meant for the future. So you see some of these Islamic countries moving away from the Islamic fiqh, the Islamic jurisprudence,
Saudi
the Islamic
Arabia
way of life. Yeah.
Saudi Arabia. And I think as Christians, we need to be much more aggressive in claiming our cultural contribution to civilization. We need to be much more verbose, much more loud, much more proud, much more determined to say, yes, we did this. First man on the moon was a Christian. First man to circumnavigate the earth was a Christian. And claim all these people that others are claiming as national heroes. We need to claim them as Christian heroes. Neil Armstrong took Eucharist on the moon. So he was saying to the world he was Christian when he did that. And I think some of the astronauts, they read from Genesis while they were up there. I forget which moon lander it was. But as Christians, as the church, we need to be much more verbose about claiming our historical cultural champions, like Gregor Mendel, who contributed to the understanding of genetics and principles hereditary, Louis Pasteur, who helped to develop concepts that led to vaccinations, and microbiology. Galileo Galilei is someone we've allowed the atheists to capture, but Galileo Galilei was a practicing Christian until the day that he died. Robert Boyle, who contributed to modern chemistry, Nicholas Copernicus, again, along with Galileo Galilei, captured by atheists. We need to claim these figures back. Blaise Pascal, his contribution to mathematics and probability theory. Michael Faraday, who discovered electromagnetic induction. George Lemaitre, who was a priest who came up with the Big Bang Theory in 1927. Like, the list goes on, but we Christians are not very good at claiming it or celebrating it, and we need to do a lot better.
Oh, absolutely. And this is why I just created a video Friday. It's on my channel now. It's how Christianity created science. It's a 40-minute video. I go through even more aspects in the way Christianity helped develop science. Like
Yeah.
there's more. I couldn't cover them all here. There are more ways that Christianity has contributed to science than what I've discussed here, which
Yeah.
really goes to show you that, like, yeah, this is the ideology that has really changed the world. It's not Islam. It's not Greek philosophy. The ideology that has really changed the world the most is Christianity. And to say otherwise is absurd nonsense.
Amen.
Everything we do is Christian. This is why, you have Tom Holland writing the book Dominion. It really has dominion over every way we think, operate, act. It's absurd the way that people do not realize this.
The reason why you don't own slaves is because of Christianity. And I think Islam, I genuinely believe that Islam could have gone in a different direction if, for instance, Ibn Rushd had been embraced rather than rejected. The Islamic civilization could have gone a different way. But
I would disagree.
Let me finish.
Yeah,
let me
sure.
finish. Let me finish. Let me land. Let me land. So I was going to make a joke, but the colonial jokes are an in joke between me and Michael. No one else is going to get the colonial jokes. But Ibn Rushd, I think if he'd been embraced, Islam could have been moving in a different direction. But the rejection of Ibn Rushd should be compared to the embracement of Thomas Aquinas, because Ibn Rushd was, rationalist, tackling Aristotle's work. Thomas Aquinas was rationalist, tackling Thomas Aquinas's work. Thomas Aquinas was made a doctor of the church. Ibn Rushd was seen as a deviant, but the poison in the water occurred with Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who was the founder of the Hanbali madhab, he was arguing against the what's the sect called now, the Mutasilites, who were using philosophy in a very Christian way. They were probably even influenced by Eastern Christians. They were using philosophy in a very Christian way to engage with theology, and Ibn Hanbal sort of like rose up against them, and that poisoning of the water always meant that philosophy was pushed away from the center of Islam. But Islam did at one point have the possibility of going a different way. And precisely as you've said, because of our engagement with complicated theology that required the use of philosophy to explain it in a philosophical world, which was the Greco-Roman world, Christians always had philosophy as a bedfellow of theology, or the handmaid, as we more appropriate call it.
Yeah, I would disagree. I just think the reason why Ibn Rushd was rejected had to do a lot with what is taught in the Hadith, what is taught in the Quran, what Muhammad said and did. And so I think the Almohads were being more true to what Islam teaches, and Ibn Rushd wasn't.
Well, you misunderstood me. I'm not saying they aren't. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying the Almohads were not doing that. I'm just pointing out that the poison in the water happened long before Ibn Rushd. It happened with Hanbal, Ibn Hanbal.
I agree. I just don't think they ever could have pivoted. That's what I'm trying to say. Like you were.
I think they could have. But it needed to have happened with the Mutasilites. That was the moment. That was the time that it could have gone a different way.
I think it would have been nice. I just don't know if it would have been actually possible long term. Just because, again, when you have like a Christian revival, or you have a Christian Reformation, we go back to what the teachings of Jesus were. We go back to what the Bible teaches. You do the same thing in Islam. You're not going to get another Ibn Rushd. You're going to get more Almohads. Like that's the problem, is what I would say. Is like when Islam is going through a revival or reformation, we should be worried. I mean, we want them to transform into something new, not get back to what Muhammad taught.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I think that this the one of the reasons why it didn't go the way of the Mutasilites, but went the way of the madhabs, is because of this emphasis on ritual. Islam is a religion of law. It's a religion that obsesses about law, and particularly ritualistic law. And that required an emphasis less on philosophy. And as you've rightly pointed out, some limited scope use of mathematics. But once it's used up to achieve those ritualistic ends, the reason for it has dried up. When the Muslims came into Alexandria, the Great Library of Alexandria, or what was left of it, because there'd been other fires before, the Great Library of Alexandria was on fire as part of the invasion. And it was said to the Muslim commander, this great library is on fire. Should we put it out? To which he replied, what do we need of their books? We have the Quran. We have the book of Allah.
Mhm.
And that very much epitomized this sort of Bedouin desert tribal caravan robbing attitude. It's like we don't need anything from these dirty kuffar. And so a lot of learning was lost. Whereas you look at the early church fathers and they're constantly engaging with paganism. They're constantly engaging with the philosophy schools and debating with them.
Yeah. It's clearly just a different culture because we stem from different books.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting history. At the end of the day, there's just no contest. Christianity has been so much more better for science.
I totally agree. Right, my brother. That was a thoroughly enjoyable presentation. And thank you so much for giving us your time and your energy. And, if you ever want me to come on your show, I'll be more than willing to come and give a talk. But I'll leave that up to you. Not that I'm trying to invite myself on,
No, of course.
edge my way back into the King's colonies. Sorry. We'll talk some more. I'd love to have you back for you to do another one of your excellent presentations that I saw at the NAPC conference, which was on Islam and women. If you're up for that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Brilliant. Right. Well, thank you very much. God bless you. And if you hang at the back of the studio, we'll just have a quick catch up once I shut down the live stream.
Sure.